The story of the Emmaus Road walk is often dismissed as not particularly important. Sometimes it's talked about, but sometimes it's more likely all ignored. But I believe that this passage defines the very failure of the Christian church worldwide. I think it also presents the only hope for Christian faith. The Church Universal has, almost from the very moment Jesus disappears into the courtroom, has begun to work solely at being preoccupied with its own feelings of disappointment, its own needs, its own prejudices, and ignoring the divine all around us. Disciples here are so very focused on their own understanding or maybe misunderstanding of the events in Jerusalem, they don't even attempt to recognize the stranger who appears and who walks alongside them. We have no real sense of how long they walked together, but long enough for them to pour out their frustration over what we would call the Easter events. Once they arrive at their house, they do invite the stranger to come in, to eat with them, to spend the night because it's late. And this is the place that the hope of the Christian faith is presented. They make an invitation. As they begin to share the meal, all of a sudden, they recognize who they've been talking with, who they've been walking with. Their eyes are opened to the presence of the divine right there in their home. That table and this table, and the many different tables that you and I are going to sit around today and in this week ahead, these tables represent the hope of what Christianity might be in our lifetime. It could get there. Open my eyes is my prayer. You get to pray that for yourself if you're interested. Years ago, I served a small startup group in St. Paul, Minnesota. If you've ever been in Minnesota, you know that it's particularly cold. And people pay attention to opening and closing doors, and they pay attention when strangers show up. We were meeting in the Friends Meeting House, which is right up on Summit Avenue. And Summit is anchored on one end by the St. Paul Cathedral, which is beautiful, and the other end is the Mississippi River that divides St. Paul from the newer city of Minneapolis. And the meeting house is beautiful. It was ancient wood, hand-carved. And you couldn't walk up to the door without just sort of feeling like maybe your grandma was going to be in there waiting to welcome you. The church was the beginning group, and so as is sort of indicative of beginning groups, they all paid attention to who came in the door, and they were very quick to open a hymn and hand it to the newcomer, a bulletin, introduce themselves, and watch afterwards and say, a group of us are going to the Panakugan House, would you like to join us for lunch? Or we're going to Sizzler in Paris, would you like to join us? Or those kinds of things. That's what beginning churches do. And on this particular occasion, a man came walking in just as we were beginning worship. We were already singing, and true to form, somebody opened a hymnal and handed it to him. Somebody else gave him a bulletin, and people began to scoot over, so if he wanted to sit by them, he could. He was a little weepy during the worship service. A number of times he bowed his head like he was just being so moved or so in pain. People paid attention. After a minute or two, somebody started passing Kleenex down the row. They were paying attention. That's what churches do. That's what churches do. At the end of the service, he was surrounded by just about everybody in the group. There's only about 30 of us. We're going to this place tonight. We're going to that place. If you want to join us, please do. And after being probably a little overwhelmed, he said, well, I'm staying with my parents, and I promised I would do a good, but I'll come back next week. Okay. And he did. The next Sunday night, he was there almost the same time. Church hadn't quite started, but he was there. He greeted people. He remembered some names, and people remembered his name. That's what churches do. And he was weepy again during the worship service. He participated in communion. He sang and he seemed to know all of the songs. He smiled and laughed at my jokes at the right places, and he thought about the heavy places. And after church, we all went off to Rudolph's barbecue, named for Rudolph Valentino, the best barbecue in the Twin Cities. And people were just chatting away, and this week we've got some things going on midweek. Joe, if you want to join us. And he said, with kind of a smile, he said, I don't live in Minnesota. I'll be going back to Pennsylvania where I live. And actually he had put off his return trip 2 days just so he could come back. So I quickly got a hold of the church directory, and I said, these are the 2 metropolitan community churches in Pennsylvania. I don't know these pastors, but I'm sure you'll find a warm welcome. And he smiled. He said, I'm familiar. Somebody said, do you need a ride to the airport in the morning? No, I'm fine. He hugged everybody, and off he went. And we felt really good about having been a very welcoming kind of person. And maybe he really will show up at those churches in Pennsylvania, and wouldn't that just be cool? On Saturday, when I went to pick up the mail from the church mailbox, there was a letter on church stationery, and the return address was the Metropolitan Community Church in Pittsburgh. And I thought, this is so cool. Not only did he show up, but he must have told the pastor there that we passed on the information, and didn't we do a good job? I was so proud of that group of people. I didn't open it. I took it to church and I read it that night. That's when I opened it. And as I'm reading along, I'm realizing it may well be it is the pastor of the Pittsburgh church, but he's talking like he was the one here. Oh my goodness. It was signed the Reverend Joseph Houle, pastor. He explained that he had come back to the Twin Cities to talk to his parents because he was thinking he was done with his pastoring stuff. It's too hard. Believing in people that won't believe in themselves, that is just excruciating. But he said, I found a bit of hope there with you. And he thanked us. I promise you there wasn't a dry eye in the place for probably the next 5 or 10 minutes. We all had to catch our breath and realize that's what churches do. Give a piece of hope. And the hope starts with you. To believe that you matter, to believe that you make a difference, to believe, kid, that when you're coughing at home and don't feel good, somebody in this place is thinking about you and praying for you. That sometimes, Leo, when you're not here, people think about you, people notice. That's what churches do. But every bit of that hope has to start in you. Yesterday, around here was this most amazing day. Boy Scouts of America have a new Eagle Scout, and his name is Antonio. And he stood up here in front of peers very proudly, sharing the oath of loyalty. And then at some point, the Master of Ceremonies had the other Eagle Scouts over here stand up and recite their pledge. And I can't tell you how moving it was when Bruce stood up, about where Georgia and Lori are sitting, where Bruce stood up. Bruce, who was an Eagle Scout, celebrated in 1954. Churches pass on the best, not the least, and not the worst. Our job is to pass on the very best. I wonder, as I hope you do too, you were in the presence, we all have been in the presence of the divine this week. We are this morning, we will be during the week. Are we going to be able to recognize Jesus when he is walking alongside of us, especially if he doesn't look like we look? Can you really, in all conscience this week, look down at somebody who's got one of those signs, go work for food, God bless you? What if that's Jesus sitting there? And I would say Jesus in a George suit. When I was first appointed to the credentialing body of Metropolitan Community Church, I had arrived. I was going to make sure that the only people that became licensed or ordained were good people. And I had my own little criteria for what good people meant. The very first executive meeting I had to go to, it just happened to be in Philadelphia. And Joseph Gilbert, not to be confused with Joe Houle, who I mentioned earlier, he was a pastor, and he sent me this letter that explained how to get from the airport in Philadelphia to the building where our meeting was going to be. And he expected me to take a train and a bus and to find this place on public transport. Excuse me, I grew up in Paramount, California. We didn't have buses. At the time, I was living in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. I didn't ride a bus, I had a car. It was Michigan. I got all grousy, but I took the train into Penn Station. I figured out eventually which exit I needed to go from that massive place. But then I'm dragging along my suitcase and my very important briefcase, grousing. Because as I look at where I'm supposed to walk, it's uphill. I'm a big, important person, and I gotta walk up this hill, dragging my suitcase, and I was not happy. There's a man sitting on the street corner, just sitting there, not bothering anybody. He looked around at me, and I did, you could not have guessed that I was a senior pastor and I was on the way to talk faith. He got up and he said, "Let me help you with your suitcase." "No, it's okay. You go, please. My name is George. It'd be my pleasure." Up we go. We get up there, and by this time I have managed to get some money out of my pocket. I'm going to give George a little bit of money for having done this wonderful thing. And he said, "Oh no, I'm a Christian. I wanted to help you because that's what Jesus would do." You're laughing over there, aren't you? You just keep laughing because Jesus in a George suit's going to show up at your house one of these days. I rang the buzzer because you couldn't get into this place where this important meeting was going to be. And I said, "Hang on a minute," because I wanted to introduce Jesus in the George suit to my colleagues. When they came and opened the door, I turned around and George had disappeared. I don't know where he went, but I don't know where he came from either. But he did what I could have done. I continue to pray, "God, help me open my eyes. You'll meet Jesus this week. Pay attention. Pay attention.